This comes from Luke chapter 9, verses 43 through 45. And all were astonished at the majesty of God. But while they were all marveling at everything he was doing, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men." But they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this. So as we're going through Luke, what's happened right before this is Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration, where three of the disciples see Jesus with Moses and with Isaiah. Jesus comes down from the mountain where the other 9 disciples are. There's a crowd, there's scribes, and there's a father whose young boy has been affected by a demon. And Jesus, who had given the disciples power to cast out demons, the disciples were unable to do so. And so this desperate father is seeking Jesus, who is above the disciples. He's trying to explain his situation to Jesus. While Jesus, Peter, and James, and John were climbing the Mount of Transfiguration, nobody could heal this boy. And so they're waiting for him. The boy is the only child of his father. The demon seems to give the boy epileptic seizures or exacerbate the epilepsy that this boy already has. What Luke doesn't really mention, if you read the verses before this, is that the demon also throws the boy into water or fire, attempting to kill him. This is recorded in Mark. It says, "And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Luke tries to present this in a much quicker resolution. Mark's really trying to give us a lot of the details of what's going on. So when the demon sees Jesus coming down from the mountain, it throws the boy down into another seizure. Now, Jesus asks the father how long the boy has suffered. And the father says, "Since childhood." The father then says, "But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus responds, "If you can. All things are possible for one who believes." And then the father gives a quite famous answer that I'm sure some of us have said, "I believe. Help my unbelief." Jesus then sees an even larger crowd running toward them and cuts this conversation with the father short. He rebukes the demon, and the boy goes into one last seizure that leaves him lying on the ground like a corpse. Jesus reaches down and helps him up, alive and healed. In the book of Matthew, it's written that the boy was healed instantly. That's from Matthew 17. Now, Mark's description may not seem instantaneous, but compared to the conversation Jesus had earlier in the book of Luke, when Jesus was talking with the legion of demons, it's a pretty accurate description. Depending on what Bible you use, you'll probably get a different word that's used to describe what happened to this boy. In the ESV, it uses the term healing, often in the context of casting out demons. But usually the source of the word is the generic Greek word for rescue or return to health. Here the Greek word primarily means to restore someone to health after a physical malady. Now Luke always reserves its use for those cases in which someone is healed from a disease. If you did not know, St. Luke was actually a physician himself. In Acts, also written by Luke, chapter 10, verse 38, Luke quotes Peter saying about Jesus, "He went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him." This indicates that in the case of this boy, he has epilepsy. That's kind of a fact, but there is a demon within him that's making it worse, that's bringing him to the point of death and destruction. You may see this as an allegory to us all having something inside of us that's not good, but that the devil tries to take it and make it worse and lead us down a darker path. Jesus' healing of the boy kind of goes beyond disease and possession. In giving him back to his father, the relationship between the boy's cultural position as his father's only child and heir is restored through this act. And I'm going to reread a part of the verse again, part that I want to focus in on. And all were astonished at the majesty of God. All refers to more than just the crowd of people that are here when Jesus does this miracle. The astonishment goes beyond this moment in time also. It most likely starts when Jesus heals the centurion's servant in Luke chapter 7, and then when he raises the widow's son. When he raises the widow's son, it's written in Luke chapter 7, verse 17, this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. All the people who had witnessed what Jesus could do marveled and were astonished. Although Luke does not explicitly say that just because they saw Jesus perform miracles, that they had faith in him. Like the events, Luke condenses Jesus' teaching. Mark says that as they passed through Galilee, Jesus led an ongoing conversation about his coming death. Unfortunately, despite repeating that he is going to be delivered unto the hands of men, suffer, be killed, and raised from the dead, it doesn't help the disciples accept his words just because he keeps saying it to them. And this comes at the end of the verse. Now, Luke connects Jesus' works with God's majesty. At another time, Jesus says in John chapter 5, verse 19, Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. Jesus is clear that he does the works of the Father gives him. Within the relationship of the persons in the Trinity, the Son glorifies the Father. That's why he told the man possessed by legion to declare how much God has done for you. Luke 8, verse 39. Not how much he, being Jesus, how much Jesus had done for him, but how much God had done for him. But they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they may not perceive it. Matthew and Mark record right after Jesus does this, and he talks about being delivered into the hands of men, that the disciples retreated to a house in private and asked Jesus why they could not cast out the demon. The disciples did not understand any of it. Not only can they not fathom what Jesus is saying about his death, but they're also now too afraid to ask, adding yet another failure to a chapter filled with them. How could these disciples who have been given the authority by God not be able to do this? How much do we blame the disciples for their failure? Jesus empowers them in Luke, at the beginning of Luke chapter 9, at the first verse, he says, and it is written rather, he called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. But now he's holding them accountable to that. Jesus says, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you and bear with you? This scathing remark that he says refers to the crowd, the scribes, this father who's brought his son, and the disciples as well. And if you go into Mark chapter 9, you can actually see Mark includes a list of everybody who is there. And now I'm kind of going to go into detail how each of these people that's there deserves blame for this boy not being healed. Jesus tells the disciples that they failed because of their lack of faith. In Matthew chapter 9, verses 19 through 20. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not cast it out? He said to them, because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, and for those of you who don't know, mustard seed is one of the smallest seeds that they had at the time, that you could really tell somebody and they would understand. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. The disciples should have believed they still had the power to cast out demons. But they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them so that they might not perceive it. For the scribes, Jesus is including the scribes who are arguing with the disciples. We don't know what they're arguing about, but when Jesus asks, the father of the possessed boy immediately appears, suggesting they're fighting about the boy, the demon, and the disciples' inability to cast it out. The scribes should have believed what they knew about Jesus in the context of the Old Testament prophecies. We see it again and again talking about him. But why does Jesus also blame the father of the boy for his little faith? Luke describes the father giving Jesus a straightforward request. In Mark 9, verse 22, it describes what the father says to Jesus. Again, and it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Note he's saying, if you can, not will you. There's no definite. There's a shaky faith. There's a belief that he may not be able to help. There's a doubt in his heart. And Jesus responds to him, if you can, a question, a charged statement, all things are possible for one who believes. And to this, the father recognizes immediately his error. And he cries out, I believe, help my unbelief. The father should have believed from the start what he had heard about Jesus' power. But yet Jesus also says it is particularly difficult to cast this demon out, requiring faith and prayer. In Mark 9:29, he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. And this kind of goes along with the father's statement talking about the tenacity of the demon not being able to be cast out. But the truth is that Jesus expects us to at least believe what we know and live out those beliefs. Faith implies trusting in what Jesus says because of what we already know. Those who really contemplate God's work in their lives should admit that they know more than enough to trust Jesus. It's not a blind faith. Jesus' description, O faithless and twisted generation. That little phrase right there actually comes from Moses' song in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Moses was approaching the end of his life, and he compared the faithlessness of God with the faithlessness of his people. He describes the Israelites in that chapter saying, they have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. Now, the term faithless describes someone who does not believe God's work. Faithlessness also indicates a lack of loyalty or trustworthiness. Twisted has more a sense of perversion or depravity. Crooked means something false, twisted, insincere, or dishonest. Instead of faithless or crooked, they use the word for rebellious or morally corrupted in the original text. All of this combines to affirm the lack of faith in Jesus and his work, indicating a morally twisted character. Disbelieving God is immoral and leads to immorality. In Romans chapter 1, verse 21, it says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. The fact that they once could cast out demons, the disciples, and now can't, indicates that their faith in Jesus is decreasing, or perhaps their faith in themselves is increasing. Again, but they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them so that they might not perceive it. When Jesus uses the term generation, he's referring to people who live at the same time, specifically those with the same characteristics. Luke records Jesus using generation to refer to his countrymen who did not identify him as the Messiah. They ignore the signs of his identity. contrary to what the people of Nineveh and the queen of Sheba, who responded to God's words immediately. Although the faithless Jews did not kill the Old Testament prophets, they are often responsible for the prophets' murder because they reject the message and refuse to teach it. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. And this is from Luke chapter 11, verses 50 through 52. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all. Woe to you, experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering. And finally, this is the generation that crucifies Jesus. Using the term generation in other passages kind of frames what Jesus is saying here. His question of, how long am I to be with you and bear with you, as a warning. There will come a day when Jesus will no longer have to bear with the faithless, those who rebelliously or carelessly reject the truth about him. At the end, they will face the great white throne of judgment and receive what they think they want, an eternity without him. But this cry that Jesus gives is also poignant. Jesus has just returned from the Mount of Transfiguration, where he spoke to Moses and Elijah about his departure. In context, that includes his crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. Moses, too, as we read, grew frustrated with the people he was responsible for, saying to God in Numbers chapter 11, verse 11, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all the people on me?" Elijah not only complained about his responsibilities, he asked God to kill him. In 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 4, he says, "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." I just want to make a quick correction. It's not Isaiah, it's Elijah that Jesus was talking to on the Mount of Transfiguration. Sorry, it's an early morning. But Jesus knows he's soon returning to God, to his Father's presence, to express his frustration with those who refuse to listen and understand him, including his own closest followers. And he looks forward to the day that he will return home. For they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they might not perceive it. Luke just mentioned the amazement of the crowd. They're stunned, both by Jesus' deliverance of the possessed boy and by his overall miraculous ministry. With that praise still on their minds, the disciples hear Jesus talk of his coming betrayal and death. The Son of Man will be betrayed. Mark explains that this is an ongoing conversation as they travel through Galilee. In the book of Luke, he condenses the events to reveal the startling realization the disciples experience. They witness Jesus' glory and power, and then they hear that the Jewish leaders will murder him. At this time, men praise Jesus, but soon they'll kill him. Judas will betray him. Peter will deny him. A mob will be manipulated into ordering his execution. The civil government tasked with upholding justice will crucify an innocent man and let Barabbas go. And the religious leaders will knowingly plan the destruction of the Messiah. Luke alone records Jesus telling the disciples to let his words sink into your ears. Jesus is reinforcing God's words to Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration, where God says to the three disciples, "This is my Son, my chosen one, listen to him." The sentiment is not unlike the seeds that fall into the good soil and grew up and yielded 100-fold. If the disciples would allow Jesus' warning to penetrate their understanding, they could use the time for great good. Instead, Luke explains that the meaning was concealed from them. since the disciples earlier refused to believe the Messiah could die. In Luke 9:21 through 22, Matthew 16:21 through 23, and Mark 8:31 through 33. They veiled their own hearts from the truth because they were not willing to accept what Jesus was meant to do, and they were not willing to accept him as he told them he was. The disciples have witnessed Jesus' greatness and divine power firsthand. They know he's not lying. They know he's telling the truth. Their ears are ringing with the praise and adoration of the crowds. Peter, John, and James saw Jesus standing with Moses and Elijah, glowing with the glory of God, and heard God's voice calling Jesus his son, affirming Jesus is the Messiah. Thus, so far, the 12 have witnessed the following miracles. All throughout the book of Luke, we were reading about these. When Jesus heals a man from a great distance, not seeing him. When Jesus raises a man from the dead. When Jesus calms a storm. When he rescues a man from a horde of demons. He raises a dead girl. Heals a chronically ill woman. Feeds thousands of people with one small lunch. And expels a demon that had spent years trying to kill a boy. The disciples had seen all of this. They were eyewitnesses to this. All of this evidence points to Jesus bringing in his great kingdom soon. The problem is that Jesus keeps saying otherwise. Christ and the disciples are traveling in Galilee, and as they go, Jesus reminds them that he's going to be killed and after 3 days be raised again. The words don't make sense to them. The people love him. He can calm a violent storm with one statement. How could the people do it to him? The problem with the 12 disciples' lack of understanding seems to be a combination of factors. Earlier, when Jesus told the disciples he was going to die, Peter rebuked him. God the Father specifically told Peter, James, and John to listen to Jesus, seemingly inferring in this statement that they were not sufficiently doing so, even though they had believed they were. Meanwhile, the other 9 were struggling with a demon despite the fact that Jesus had given them authority over all evil spirits. After the resurrection, in Luke 24, Jesus will tell his followers on the road to Emmaus that their unbelief proved they were foolish and slow of heart. So despite everything they had seen and heard firsthand, the disciples' faith is still weak. They believed Jesus within their own worldview. When Jesus, the real Jesus, drifts into areas that do not match their expectations, their ears and their hearts conceal the truth from them. In Luke, he continues showing that the disciples' hardness of heart is not limited to Jesus' future. While they're at this house afterwards, after Jesus has done this and rebuked them, they begin, and they're arguing about, why could we not cast out the demon? They also begin arguing about who is greatest. They tried to stop a man from casting out demons in Jesus' name later on, an ability that Jesus gave them, but that they failed at. And even later, they even offer to call fire from heaven on an inhospitable village. These are the 12 disciples doing these things. When Jesus is present on earth, even his own disciples don't understand him or the kingdom of God. He had to leave so the Holy Spirit could indwell his followers and speak directly to our hearts. Luke 9 swings wildly from highs to lows. It begins with the disciples experiencing a great victory. They use Jesus' empowerment to heal, cast out demons, and spread the message of God's kingdom. Peter even confesses that Jesus is the Messiah. We read about weeks ago, "Who do you say I am?" 3 of the disciples even get to see Jesus' glory on the Mount of Transfiguration. But after the Transfiguration, the disciples lose sense of the narrative. They're defeated by a demon. They can't understand Jesus' warning about the crucifixion. They even reject a potential ally and offer to burn down a village. In this story of them and the house, it takes center stage as they argue about who is greatest. But Jesus' rule will not look like the world. And Jesus explains that status in God's kingdom is based on humility and not position. A child has no power and is therefore humble. Seemingly powerless and humbled, Jesus will submit to the hands of men who will kill him. The disciples need to learn otherwise, or need to learn likewise. As Jesus and the disciples traveled from the Mount of Transfiguration to Capernaum, they engaged in two different conversations. Jesus reminded them of his coming betrayal and crucifixion. And out of earshot is at this house, that's where they begin arguing about who is greatest. But Jesus overhears them, or rather he knew what was in their hearts already. And that's when Jesus says in Luke chapter 9, verse 48, "For he who is least among you all is the one who is great." Jesus is also, at this time, begins talking about the humblest state of children. They have no social or political power. To be great in the kingdom, Jesus' followers must take on the humble position of a child and serve others. Jesus exemplifies this on the cross and gives a practical example of this when he washes the disciples' feet. But they did not understand the saying, and it was concealed from them so that they might not perceive it. How Jesus answers is so important. He does so not by answering their question directly of saying, "Oh yeah, it's Peter. Peter's the greatest," or whoever. He answers them by answering the question that is in their hearts, not the question that comes from their lips. He's more concerned with their heart than they are. Andrew and Peter are fishermen who own their own boats. James and John are their partners. Matthew was a tax collector. We don't know the jobs of the other disciples, but the fact that they were able to leave their jobs suggests that they were not lower-class slaves or laborers, as many in the Roman Empire were. The disciples are roughly middle-class men, looking forward to having positions of authority in the court of the renewed Jewish nation. Like many who see the promise of greater things on the horizon, they start preparing by considering where they stand now. Like everyone else of their time, they were also looking to God's return as a sort of political thing, as they look to him to come on a horse, not a donkey. They accept that Jesus is the Messiah, and Jesus has affirmed their belief. Some of Jesus' teachings create a mental disconnect for them, though, such that their minds can't keep up. Several times, Jesus has warned them, again, the religious leaders are going to kill him. And then, 3 days later, he'll rise from the dead. But he's also told them that they must be willing to be crucified and lose their lives to save them. Those words don't make any sense of their expectations. So they cling to what they understand. Jesus will be king, and they will reign with him. In response, Jesus gives more confusing words. To respect children is to respect Jesus. The least will be the greatest. This goes against everything the world has told them. First, Jesus says that the disciples must receive a child. A child has no status or power. They cannot reciprocate honor or favors. Jesus' followers must be willing to accept and show hospitality to those who cannot repay. To do so is to accept and show hospitality to Jesus, and ultimately, God the Father. Second, Jesus' followers must endeavor to have the same status as a child. Matthew records, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Jesus demonstrates this type of attitude when he washes their feet. It's not a plea for blind faith, but a call to trust based on imperfect knowledge. In this context, one's name wasn't sounds and syllables. One's name referred to character, reputation, authority. To receive a child in Jesus' name means to treat them as Jesus would, with benevolence and protection. To emulate Jesus in this way demonstrates that the person is a follower of Christ. And since he does the work of his Father, it demonstrates that this person accepts his Father as well. Now this passage is a companion to Luke, earlier in Luke chapter 9, verse 22 through 23, or 23 through 27. In both cases, Jesus tells his disciples to reject what the world values for the sake of their future position in the kingdom of God. Here, it's worldly status and honor. In the earlier teaching, it was their lives. We hear the disciples learning about Jesus more deeply in this passage. At least once, he told the disciples that they will need to sacrifice if they want to be associated with him. I read this, I think, a couple weeks ago, when he said to all, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels." The disciples have missed the point, and instead they argue over personal glory and ranking. Jesus tells them that in God's kingdom, the one who is least is actually the greatest. Jesus even readdresses this same issue right before the crucifixion. Even at that late stage in the game, he still has to fight this. I think we often see ourselves in the same position as the disciples. We often hear God's word, we hear Jesus, but do we really accept it? Do we accept Jesus as he said he was, or do we try to fit him into this belief of who he really is, of our belief of who he is? Do we look for the truth, or do we listen to our truth? When I just read from Luke, talking about picking up and carrying your cross, oftentimes in a lot of churches, I don't think we have that problem here, but people, they'll read that and they think it's, making small sacrifices such as getting up on a Sunday at 8 in the morning. They don't realize it's also, talking to your coworkers or being belittled in public. As I talked about a few weeks ago, we see what each of the disciples goes through as they're crucified. If you look at Christians in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq, some of the trials that they've gone through in recent times, in places like Mozambique or in Mali, we see Christians being killed for their faith. This is a reality. It's not just something that happened, 2,000 years ago, or is something that's stuck in a book. That can still happen to this day. We are called to carry our crosses and to suffer for his sake. That's what it really means to accept Jesus, to accept the truth, the reality of that. That it's not just, I'm going to live my life and it's going to be perfect and God's going to take care of me on this world. We are called to suffer as Jesus suffered. If you'd all please bow your heads with me for a word of prayer.